Great, thanks very much. James Hyde from CIBC in the Sydney office. Welcome to day 3 of Diggers and Dealers. Thanks for turning up early this morning. It's always a tough session, but we've got a pretty exciting panel this morning, and we're starting off with Mike Young. Mike's the Managing Director and CEO of Vimy Resources Limited, which is focused on the Malga Rock project, uranium project in Western Australia. He's also a non-executive chairman of Cassini Resources. Mike, as I'm sure some of you will know, is the first MD of a BC Iron and played an integral role in taking that company through to production as a significant iron ore producer. Mike is a geologist and a graduate of the prestigious Queen's University in Canada. We had the privilege of hearing Mike speak at our dinner last year, and he's also a very entertaining presenter. Thanks, Mike.
The university actually had a quota on local people that had to go, so I just got in luckily that way. So, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the Diggers and Dealers Forum for inviting me to speak. I love this forum. It's my 15th year, and I still haven't died from cirrhosis, so I'm proud of that. I'm going to start off with something very important to me that should wake you all up. This symbol, thank you. Oh, don't boo. I'm Canadian. I'll be offended. This symbol tends to evoke emotion, irrational emotion in people. This is the most successful football club in Australian history. It's got a good business model, and what's good for Collingwood's good for the game. So you shouldn't be irrational about this, but it does. It's one of those symbols that stirs up emotions in people. For the Americans in the audience, same thing with the Yankees. The Yankees tends to, they're the Collingwood of baseball in America. And for the Canadians in the audience, the Winnipeg Jets. Actually, you actually should hate Winnipeg. Winnipeg is the Adelaide of Canada, so. Another symbol we get emotional about, good. Another one we get emotional about, I love nickel, Cassini, and of course, uranium. We all get emotional about uranium for various reasons, and most of the emotions are unfounded. Now, as I was preparing for the talk, I was doing a lot of research on uranium and about the myths, and there's a lot of work out there. We've got some books in our booth that have a lot of information on dispelling those myths. Julian Tapp, who works for us, has done a very good paper on that we also have. But I found a quote which I thought was really telling. This is a lady who is on a panel. It's the United Nations Committee for the effects of atomic radiation. She was on a committee that studied the health effects of the Chernobyl accident. And she said this, she said, "I can assure you that none of us are in the pay of the nuclear industry. I was very anti-nuclear until I worked on the after effects of the Chernobyl accident. Now I am very pro-nuclear, as I realize that we have an unwarranted fear of radiation, probably due to all the rubbish about nuclear winter we were fed during the Cold War." This is a really powerful quote from a lady who studied the health effects of the Chernobyl accident. And we all know all the myths out there, and they need to be dispelled. And Australia needs to get off its arse and embrace uranium as an industry. We lost out to the Canadians in the 80s and 90s. We lost out to the Namibians in the 90s and the 2000s, and we lost out to the Kazakhs. There's a wall of demand coming out of China, Asia, and Europe, and we need to get on board. That's it for politics today. Let's just keep cracking on. So nuclear power is a non-fossil base for baseload. It really is the only form of non-fossil baseload other than hydro. It has very low CO2 emissions, we know this. It's about the same as hydro and wind energy, and it's one of the cheapest forms of electricity. In fact, something that people don't know is that the fuel costs are approximately 6% of the total cost of electricity. So utilities are very insensitive to fuel costs because most of the cost, of course, is capital. Uranium occurs as a natural isotope 238, so when you have a lump of uranium from the mine, it's about 99.3% inert uranium-238, about 0.7%, 235. That has to be upgraded to about 5% for fuel, and it can't blow up. You need about 95% to have weapons-grade uranium, and it's very, very difficult to do, as the Iranians are discovering. Now, 1 kilogram of uranium. This ball here, if this were a lump of uranium fuel, it would weigh a kilogram. It's quite a dense material. It's a high density energy form. That would power 7 Australian homes for a year, that lump of uranium. It would replace 16 tons of coal and offset 45 tons of CO2. Our project, Mulga Rock, east of Kalgoorlie, will produce enough uranium oxide to power 7 reactors, 7 1-gigawatt reactors, and it will offset 50 million tons of CO2, 8% of Australia's entire CO2 output. So we have a lot of people who are saying we shouldn't be exporting coal, a lot of people saying we need to reduce our CO2. Well, the best way we can do that is by shipping uranium to the world so they can offset CO2. It doesn't matter what you think about global warming and CO2. The fact of the matter is it's become a policy issue for many countries. And I've decided I can't fight it. I have views on global warming because I'm a geologist. But one thing I do know is that if you want to offset CO2, uranium is the only way you're going to do it with baseload power. So I want to talk a little bit about power because we hear a lot of these terms, but you need to understand the context. We measure capacity in terms of watts electric. You'll often see these symbols, kilowatts E, megawatts E, and that's because thermal nuclear power plants and coal plants put out a lot of thermal power and only about 30% of it's captured as electricity. So that's why we have little e. And an output is measured in watt hours. So we talk about kilowatt hours, we talk about megawatt hours, and we talk about gigawatt hours. So an average Australian home uses about 6 megawatt hours a year in power. Power generation, power plants are labeled by installed capacity. So we talk about 5 megawatt reactors, 800 megawatt reactors like Muja, and a gigawatt reactor. And most reactors that we talk about in the world today, when we're talking about the number of reactors, we're basically talking about a gigawatt, although they are getting bigger. Capacity factor is the availability. So it's how long are you burning the fuel for in a year? You've got fuel fill, you've got maintenance, and with solar and wind, you've got when is the wind blowing, when is the sun shining. So a gigawatt reactor at 90% capacity factor, you've got 8,760 hours in a year. That produces about 8,000 gigawatt hours of electricity. It's a lot. Example 2, this is the MacArthur wind farm. Now I'm not dissing wind farms, but I think it's really important to understand the context when you see things written about wind farms and people saying this is the solution to baseload power. It's not, and I'll show you why. So this has 420 megawatts of installed capacity over 55 square kilometers. Last year, it had a 27% capacity factor. And I know that because I rang them up and asked them. They produced 977 gigawatts of electricity. Based on that wind farm, I calculated that it would cost $16.2 billion to produce a wind farm capable of producing 8,000 gigawatt hours in a year for 60 years, which is what a nuclear plant will do. It would cover 400 square kilometers, and you would need 1,500 wind turbine generators. So when you see 18 windmills down at Albany, and you think, well, that's the answer to global warming, multiply that by 100. So wind has its place, solar has its place, especially in base load and peak load. Base load can only be done by hydro, fossil fuels, and nuclear. They're the only options. But the peak load demands, of course, when the sun's shining bright, we need air conditioners, and that's when that can be used. So I want to talk a little bit about uranium. We've heard a lot about it. We hear about it in the press. Gus Simpson gave a good talk the other day. There are more reactors under construction in the world today than there were when the Fukushima accident happened. So the build is occurring, mainly in China, Russia. Russia's building about a third of the reactors today. The increased demand will come out of China. They need about 15 gigawatts electric of installed capacity this year. Now what's interesting is that when you do start a reactor, you need about 12,000 ton of concentrate when you turn the reactor on. You do a fuel fill in the reactor core of about 2 to 3 years, depending on the design. And then you definitely, after you've spent $5 to $8 billion building a reactor, you definitely want to have a few years of fuel up your sleeve. And this is how the industry works. It's a long-term industry. It's a contract industry. The price that we hear, the spot price, is about 7% of the market. And of that, 70% are arbitrators and traders. So it's a very small part of the market, but it's the headline price, unfortunately. And coincidentally, the uranium price today is the same price, uranium price per pound at $36 is the same price that iron ore was when I took over BC Iron. So I think there's a good parallel there. You want to get on board. It's trading at 10-year lows, and because of that, we have project delays. We've now seen what's happened with Ranger and Jabiluka. So before ERA's announcement, Mulga Rock was the 7th largest deposit in Australia, and now it's the 5th largest because those two have been basically neutered. We think the long-term prices are going to be at least $75, particularly around the time that we get into production. And the growing demand has definitely slowed investment in, there is growing demand, but we have slowing investment. There's some very good articles that we have down at the booth from the Minerals Council and from WA's DMP, and I suggest having a look at those because they're very, very good and very informative. And the World Nuclear Association's got a great website. China's coal use, 5 billion tons by 2020. They'll be using 5 billion tons of coal by 2020. It's a big number. So I had a look at it and I said, okay, well, Dakin Rail in China, they have 20,000 tons on a train that's 3 kilometers long. There's 6,200 ton per kilometer, and 5 billion tons would go to the moon and back on a train. Nearly half of China's railroad is being used for coal, just coal, and they've got a lot of other stuff to move around. The rail network can't sustain the energy growth. So I thought, what would a train look like, end to end, with 1 day's worth of coal on it? And that's it. It would run from Fremantle to 400 kilometers shy of Adelaide. By the time that train gets to Kalgoorlie, you've got enough coal for 6 a.m. By the time it gets to the South Australian border, it's about 6 p.m. That's how big a train would be carrying 1 day's worth of coal in China. It's pretty sobering. And you can see why China has such a particulate pollution issue and CO2 emissions issue. So the demand in China for clean power is real. Their growth rate this century has been around 10%. The expected average is 5 to 6% year on year over the next 20 years, which means the economy will treble in size. By 2035, the average wealth measured by GDP per capita will approach $30,000 per person, which is quite low by our standards in this country, but considering they're less than 10,000, it's quite high. So on this graph shows kilowatt hours per person per year on the bottom. It's an electricity intensity graph. And that's US per capita coming up here. And there's a very good regression between this. America's sitting up here. Some of these outliers are countries in the Middle East and the Scandinavian countries where it's either really, really hot or really, really cold, and they use a lot of electricity. China moving up this curve, they go from just under 5,000 kilowatt hours per person to just under 10,000. They're big numbers. BP did an energy outlook in 2015. It was a good read, cured my insomnia. In 2035, China will be the world's largest energy importer. Their energy production will rise by 47%. And coal is going to be a big part of that, make no mistake. And their consumption grows by 60%. Other developments, the population peaks around 1.45 billion. As I say, their energy consumption goes up to 7,000. China needs to build 1 gigawatt of additional capacity every week for the next 20 years to meet these targets. I heard someone whistle because they're big numbers. Right now they've got 24 reactors, 26 under construction, and 150 by 2030. That's in the current 5-year plan. The next 5-year plan comes out relatively soon, and we'd expect those numbers to go up. 150 reactors needs 30,000 ton of uranium concentrate. Currently the world uses 68,000 ton. So that's 50% of the current world's needs. So that's going to drive prices. The International Energy Agency of the OECD have growth strategies, growth scenarios they call them, in nuclear energy. What this is showing is it's showing the terawatt hours currently in the world, and it's showing the growth. The bars in the middle are the growths, and those bars are their scenarios on the growth of nuclear power. What they've got at the end is they've got what's called the 450 scenario. That's this one here. The 450 scenario is a scenario which seeks to limit the long-term increase in average global temperature to 2 degrees by keeping CO2 at 450 ppm in the atmosphere. As I say, it doesn't matter what your beliefs are. These are what's driving policy around the world. To do that, we need a 161 increase in the current reactors in the world. They're big numbers. This is a great graph done by Mark Busuttil at JP Morgan. It's a uranium price graph where it's called an incentive price graph. What it plots is it plots current known deposits in the world that are at fairly advanced stages but not operating. On the left-hand side, you have the cost of uranium concentrates in US dollars per pound, and on the bottom, you've got demand. So we start at 0 because that's today, and as demand increases to bring new products on, you can see the price has to go up. It makes intuitive sense. It's a price curve. Now, the thing is a lot of supply needs to come on over the next several years, and uranium's a long-term proposition. So using those numbers I was talking about, we think that by 2017 the uranium price needs to be up around $70. It needs to be starting going up this curve. There's quite a hiatus at 80. A lot of Kazakh production should come on, but longer term, when you start looking at 50 to 60,000 tons of uranium, and I mean longer term, 2025, 2030, right in the middle of our mine life, you're up at $95. So let's talk about the Mulga Rock Uranium Project. The Mulga Rock Uranium Project was discovered by the Japanese back in the 1980s. They basically came in and drilled a series of drill holes along a line for 168 kilometers. It was a blind deposit. It has no surface expression, and had they not done that, I doubt it would be discovered. It's quite large. It's the second largest uranium deposit in Western Australia at 73 million pounds. It's got very simple geology, mining, and metallurgy. And at the moment, the scoping study defined a 16-year life of mine with production of 47 million pounds. But the current PFS identifies upside on the resource, the cost, and the life of mine. So that PFS will be released in September, and we expect to have better news. We're targeting first production in 2018, which comes around quick. The pre-feasibility study, as I say, will be out in September, and we'll immediately hook into the feasibility study. And we would like to be at an investment decision and commencement of some earthworks in the second half of 2016. Current state and federal government supports uranium mining. Federal Labor doesn't have a position against it, but as we know, the state Labor has a position against uranium mining. However, our view is that once we have our PERs and our mining approvals, they won't be in a position to stop us. And we have that from them. We have a very experienced management team. As you know, I used to run BC Iron. We took that from first drill hole to first ore and ship in under 4 years. And Julian Tapp, who worked with me on the FMG side, is with us. He's doing approvals and government relations. Tony Chamberlain's our metallurgist. Tony's very experienced in uranium, and Tony's done a huge job in the last year getting the project up and running and cracking some of the metallurgy that I'll talk about. Last year, we spent about 83% of our funds directly on the ground. The deposit itself comprises two large deposit areas. One's called Ambassador Princess. We call that Mulga Rock East and Mulga Rock West. It's a big area. These are 10-kilometer squares, so you're looking at a very, very large area. The patches on there are just fire scars. It's in the Great Victoria Desert. It's a fairly inert landscape with no water, no rivers, and therefore no local inhabitants. The closest local town is Laverton, about 200 kilometers away. And Tropicana Gold Mine just up the road. Now, Tropicana and Anglo have been very good in helping us, and I'd like to thank Mike and his team for the help that they give us, giving us access to the private haul road, and also future access to the airstrip, and we've got a good relationship with them, and we're looking forward to building on that as a good neighbor. The deposit itself sits in a sedimentary basin between the Yilgarn and the Fraser Mobile Range. So geologically, you're looking at sediments which have organic material in them. The top 50 meters has been weathered, and basically it's about 45 meters down. You've just got a big flat slab of uranium-bearing carbonaceous material. It's a very simple mineralogically. It's just uraninite stuck on the carbon. But the size of it, this is the pit outline for what we call the Ambassador and Princess pits. So our starter pit will be here, and that's our Ambassador pit. Now, I got this idea. Richie Bevan from Cassini did this, and I thought, ooh, ours is bigger. I'm going to do ours too. So if you stick this over here at the new stadium, it comes down through the city, and it comes down through Kings Park into UWA. Now, we find that the uranium grades north of the river tend to be better than the uranium grades south of the river. So now, if you're from, you like Rottnest? That's what it looks like superimposed on Rottnest. So it's big. If you've been on a bicycle riding around Rottnest, you know it's not small. That's Melbourne. So the city of Melbourne, the port, I think the MCG is over here, the CBD is there. I deliberately didn't mine Collingwood, obviously, but I did go for Carlton. We've completely obliterated Carlton. And this is Sydney, and you can see how big it is. So it's a big deposit. In cross-section, as I say, you're basically looking at flat-lying deposits. And this is what it looks like. This was a test pit that was dug by the Japanese back in the 1980s. It was all free dig. There is a small sill creep band in there, but it's essentially free dig. You can see that on there. And you go from the bleached sediments down into the black ore body very, very quickly. So we'll be hiring colorblind geologists. It's very black and white. In fact, that contact there in some of the core is just absolutely knife edge. And what I thought was we'd have some unemployed geologists with little trowels just sort of scraping the white stuff off so we can expose the black stuff. In terms of where the project's, it's a busy slide, but what I wanted to show you was that's Ranger, and this is Vimi's Mulga Rock deposit. The size of the bubble is the contained metal, and that's our resource tons and grade. So it sits in a good cloud. This is in the presentation. We have the slide so you can have a look at that later. The metallurgy is very simple. It's going to be a very simple acid leach process. If you're interested in this, come and see us. We've got a very good slide on this at the booth. But basically, it'll just go through an acid leach plant. But the real important thing that we've had is basically we have shown that the ore body is basically carbonaceous material with sand in it. And the sand is inert. It doesn't carry any of the uranium. And using very simple spirals, very simple gravity separation, we can remove about 75% of the mass, 60 to 75% of the mass, with a very small loss in uranium grade, and we get an upgrade of about 3. And what that means is that the main plant, the leach tanks, the tailings dam, are all much, much smaller than we'd anticipated during the scoping study. So look, I've been a bit light on the project itself because I wanted to talk a bit more about the uranium thing. Come down to the booth and see us. We've got lots of information there, and the whole team is here today. So please come and see us. Lastly, the scoping study shows that at $75, this thing makes a lot of money. It's a very, very good, robust project, and on the price curve, it sits in the 3rd quartile. So once we get this up and running, this is going to be a very successful and a very good operation of about over 20 years. And that's our hardworking Xavier in the booth last night, safety helmet on, and all the beer he needs. And that's it. I'll leave it with that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. Probably got time for one quick question. If anyone's got a question for Mike, please shout out. It's pretty hard to see you from up here. Okay, great. Thanks, Mike.